This is my second talk in the helpline, and I would like, even more than in the first occasion, to thank Tom, Jan, and all of you, because in the course of a year and a half, I have learned a great deal about another woman I mistakenly thought I knew. And much more, I'm sure I will learn from the next season. As last year, I intend again to take advantage of this privileged venue to ask for help and suggestions on a topic that has forced me out of my comfort zone for two reasons. I am not an expert in the history of religion and nor in anthropology. So I am not sure to master the deeper dimensions of the issues I'm confronted with. Also, and above all, the problem I would like to address is thorny and in many ways disturbing. In fact, behind the neutral expression special deaths are hidden, indeed I have hidden, Herodotus instances of human sacrifice, which have been often read since antiquity through a thick ideological lens. Special indeed they are, and yet they do not seem to have a distinctive status compared to other forms of secular killing, torture, and horrific cruelty that punctuate the narrative of the histories. Nonetheless, since the notion of human sacrifice, although controversial and hard to define, can in itself be deeply distressing, I hope to be able to deal with it as sensitively as possible. Just a note on my handout. You probably received, the passages are listed in the order in which they appear in the histories. The numbers indicate the episodes usually mentioned in studies about human sacrifice, the letters, those interpreted as such only by some scholars. The reason why I chose this topic, surely not the most appropriate to close the Helpline summer season, is once again, I'm back there, Herodotus' theatrical depiction of the scene of the burning of Croesus. Despite having read it countless times, I had always missed a detail, perhaps significant and in any case worthy of attention. Cyrus' planned execution of Croesus is presented by Herodotus in terms of a pretended human sacrifice. Curiously, in the studies devoted to this topic, the episode is not taken into account, probably because Croesus survives and no sacrifice takes place. Nevertheless, two things struck me about Herodotus' version. First, the assertion that Cyrus commanded 14 young Lydians to be burned alive along with Croesus. On the other hand, and more clearly, the reason that the historians assumes for Cyrus' decision. Cyrus may have intended to sacrifice him as a victory offering to some god, or he may have wished to fulfill a vow, or perhaps he had heard that Croesus was a pious man and put him atop the pyre to find out if some divinity would deliver him from being burned alive. The first peculiarity of the account, at least in my opinion, is the reference to the 14 Lydian Paides whom Cyrus puts on the pyre together with Croesus. Their presence is ghostly, because in the wall of the following account, they are not mentioned anymore, while the action revolves around the sole Croesus, who appears to be alone on the pyre. Another curious detail is the articulation of their number 14 as dis hepta, twice 7. This constitutes a variation with respect to the two other occurrences of the same number, 14, at the opening of the same chapter. Croesus, Herodotus says, had reigned 14 years and had been besieged for 14 days. This figure and its close reiteration certainly bears a symbolic value, but I would like to focus on other aspects. The expression disepta sounds like a sort of ritual formula, but means also, though not explicitly, that the young victims were parted into groups according to their sex, 7 girls and 7 boys. In Bacchylides, in Ode 17:2-3, the same formulation is used for the young Athenians, 7 girls and 7 boys, sent to King Minos to be offered to the Minotaur. As to Herodotus, an identical formulation occurs only once more in the histories, again in a context of human sacrifice performed by Persians. And it's the number 11 of the handout. In 113 and 14, Herodotus reports that when Xerxes' army marching towards Greece arrived at the river Strymon, the Magi sacrificed wild horses and performed many other magical rites. After learning that the place was called 9 Roads, they buried alive 2 groups of 9 boys and 9 girls, and it said, children of natives. Here, Herodotus opened an authorial parenthesis, commenting that the practice of burying people alive is a Persian custom, because I hear that in her old age, Xerxes' wife Amestri too had disepta children, whose parents were distinguished Persians, buried alive as a gift on her behalf to the god who is supposed to live underground. The digression on Amestri poses some problems, to which I shall return in my conclusion. For now, while the events at the 9 Roads directly connected to the excursus on Amestris make clear, at least in my view, that the disepta victims of the queen were parted according to their sex. In the case of the Cresus Laudus, instead, the same expression sounds somehow mysterious, ritual, both in wording and meaning. Anyway, as Christos Tsagalis has pointed out, between 186 and 114, there are parallels in the subject and in the linguistic usage that cannot be the result of simple coincidence. The affinities lead to believe that the historian wanted to emphasize the conceptual link between the 2 situations, beyond the difference in the mode of sacrifice, burning alive, burying alive. The latter form is said to be typical of the Persians. My impression at this stage, a little more than a guess, is that the insertion of the disepta Lydian children in 186 could be a later addition, a touch of something more to enhance the presentation of Croesus' execution in terms of a Persian human sacrifice. This impression is grounded on Herodotus' intervention about Cyrus' likely motivation. These two appear rather peculiar if considered in the light of what Herodotus himself tells in 131 and 316 about Persian religious customs, especially the worship of fire and the interdiction of burning corpses, as well as of his overall positive portrait of this king. Moreover, the execution, ideally public and solemn, of the vanquished enemy king was a well-established practice in the Bronze Age Near East, and later widely documented among the Assyrians. Certainly, the whole logos of Croesus rests on the preferential, though problematic link that the king of Lydia had established with the Greek god, and the third motivation explicitly alludes to it. But the miraculous salvation could have come to Croesus even if the burning had simply been an execution as a consequence of the defeat, without having to attribute to the Persian king the will to offer a human sacrifice or a thanksgiving ex voto. The passage, as been recently observed by Elizabeth Irwin, is rather striking also from a rhetorical point of view, because while alternative versions of the same episode taken from different sources are a sort of trademark of Herodotian methodology, he hardly intervenes to present his own possible explanations of a character's behavior with two different alternatives. This instance, where the three possibilities are foreseen, is a unicum in the histories. Of the three possible explanations, the last one, to test Croesus' Eusebeia, brings Cyrus closer to the model of the inquisitive Oriental king, and is the least connoted as human sacrifice, since it can be considered as a kind of ordeal. Eventually, it proves to be the correct one, as we learn from what follows. After Croesus' miraculous salvation, Cyrus realized that Croesus was in the gods' favor and was a good man. Theophiles kai ragazzos. Finally, a quick comparison with the other surviving version of the same episode, which I omit, show that it is only Herodotus who attributes to Cyrus the thought of sacrificing Croesus to some deity. Beyond the version in which the burning is a voluntary act of the king of Lydia, the Amphora of Muson and Bacchylides, it is rather a solemn and spectacular public execution, especially in Nicolaus of Damascus, but not a sacrifice. Aiming to better investigate, if possible, the reasons that could have brought Herodotus to give the burning of Croesus a veneer which I suspect artificial and perhaps intended of Persian human sacrifice, I decided to explore the whole dossier concerning the cases of the same practice within the histories. And predictably, I found myself in trouble. The first obstacle I encountered was in calculating how many cases of human sacrifice are recorded by Herodotus. For instance, Francois Togge, in the Mirror of Herodotus, writes that apart from the Scythians, the only people to practice human sacrifice in the histories are the Tauri and the Thracian Absinthians. On the contrary, Pierre Boncher, in his 1994 book Les Sacrifices Humains et Res Anciennes, listed as many as 16 occurrences. Renaud Gagné says 14, but the passages are the same as Boncher. Robert Rollinger lists 4, plus 5 episodes of slaying of children as sacrifice. Most recently, Gianfranco Chiai, in the entry Human Sacrifice in the Herodotus Encyclopedia, records 11 cases. To this flexible basic group are sometimes added a number of other episodes which, although not counted as relevant by scholars of religion, are interpreted as such in other studies. The case of Croesus, I realize, would also fall into this category, since Robert Rollinger alone includes it in his analysis. Among these extra episodes that are the letter B and C in the handout, the most significant is undoubtedly the one Herodotus described in 3:11, where Greek and Carian mercenaries in Egypt slew the son of Phanes of Halicarnassus, a Carian commander who deserted the pharaoh Amasis to join Cambyses, and then drank their blood mixed with wine before giving battle. While David Asheri, in his commentary on the passage, did not exclude the possibility of a human sacrifice, William Desmond, in 2004, is more inclined to explain it as a form of father-son punishment and ritual vengeance, another well-attested topic throughout the histories. At the heart of these fluctuations lies a fundamental reason, which is a general feature of the very rich, now very rich literature on the issue, namely the difficulty of defining what exactly constitutes a human sacrifice. The absence of an unambiguous and shared definition seems in this field to be particularly striking. The expression itself poses several problems, especially in light of its very generic semantic range. The debate in historical, religious, and anthropological studies has produced a series of important distinctions, but the formula continues to be used to cover a broad variety of acts. Certainly, the core reference is to the killing of human beings in spatial, non-profane context, but as sometimes pointed out, the exact dimension and definition of the phenomenon cannot ignore a series of crucial parameters which require further clarification. The means of the execution, the type of the victims, the actor, the timing, and the function of the rite. In any case, scholars now tend to recognize a basic distinction between the concept of human sacrifice and ritual killing. Indeed, not all ritual killings of men or animals are to be classed as sacrifice. What the precise demarcation is, however, is more problematic to establish. A partition that is usually made is to consider the actual sacrifice as an offering to the gods or divinity or to a being that is more than human, while ritual killing as a special act performed in certain contexts, funerals, religious ceremonies, a battle, according to a precise and repetitive sequence of acts. These killings would not be properly sacrifices. Other than that, scholars have identified a specific practice called following into death, Totenfolge, mort d'accompagnement, which refers to voluntary or morally enforced suicide, but also to human killing at the grave of a deceased against the will of the victim concerned. These rituals should not be confused with sacrifices since they have an entirely different ratio. The occurrence of this practice of following into death can be traced over time and in many areas of the world, and as far as the histories are concerned, the custom is described for the Scythians and the Thracians, so I will come back to this in connection with these passages. Finally, as Robert Rollinger and most recently Maria Fragulacchi in her splendid entry, Death, of the Herodotus Encyclopedia, have undisputedly shown, human sacrifice, even in its most inclusive sense, represents a very small fraction within a vast repertoire of episodes of cruelty, torture, and violent death described by Herodotus, committed by barbarians as well as by Greeks. Crucifixion, impaling, beheading, burning, whipping, strangling, stoning, blinding, flaying, and so on. Herodotus, I quote Ovid Street, is interested in deaths and circumstances of death if they are extraordinary in some way. The mechanics of violence and death are always described by the historian with a sort of detached gaze, and even in the case of immolations of human victims, almost never accompanied by an explicit moral judgment, explicit moral judgment. Also, his narrative does not seem aimed at arousing any particular emotional reaction. A second difficulty I met, less factual, but more insidious, is the relationship always highlighted between the absence of historical proof of human sacrifice in Greece, at least from the Iron Age onwards, and the Herodotus descriptions of this practice among the barbarian peoples. Whatever the exact number of the cases in the history, there is no doubt that only 2 or 3, if we count letter C, of them refers to the Greeks. One is set in mythical times, and I will show you later, and condemned as pragma uk osion. The other, also of mythical etiology, is told in very unclear terms. Those remaining, much more numerous, are all ascribed to foreign people. According to several scholars, this discrepancy should be considered as just one illustration among many of the typical Greek ethnocentrism. The historian's attitude, if placed in this dimension, should be interpreted of an ideological rather than historical, ethnographic, or even narrative basis, as part of or a mirror of the creation of the barbarian stereotype. On this standpoint, however, Herodotus is not at all alone. On the contrary, appears to be just one illustration of a much more widespread trend, since the figure of the external and biased reporter is crucial in any discussion of the existence of human sacrifice in every civilization, regardless of epoch or latitude. On this issue, the introduction of the editors Bonnecher and Gagné to their 2013 volume seems to me particularly instructive. Returning now to Herodotus' approach, according to most scholars, either through lack of information or superficiality in collecting erroneous tradition, or consciously, he would have included in his work, exaggerated, misunderstood, or even invented the episodes and rituals concerning the offering of human victims in use by the barbarian peoples, precisely to mark their antithetical character compared to the Greek mentality and civilization, where human sacrifice was considered, in quoting Jan Bremer, the crime par excellence. In this regard, it will suffice to recall, as an example, Pierre Bonnecher's clear-cut judgment about the historian's aim in blurring the account about the Greek rites connected to Zeus Laphistius. That is, number 13 was the previous slide I forgot to show you. It is well known that throughout his work, Herodotus was reluctant to speak of Greek human sacrifice, eager as he was to blame them on the barbarians. In short, the higher the level of ethnocentrism attributed to the historian, the less reliable and more partisan are considered the information he offers on the subject of human sacrifice. An example, at least in my view, of over-interpretation of Herodotus' text is the episode described in 166-67 about the Agyllei, the Etruscans of Cere, who, after the Battle of Alelia, stoned to death the Phocian prisoners. Herodotus writes that the people of Agylla were subjected to the divine wrath as a result of the stoning, and after seeking the advice of the Delphic oracle, they instituted games in honor of the dead. Although the episodes lacks any marker of sacrifice in terms of vocabulary, ritual, and offering to the deity, and in fact it is not taken into account in studies on the subjects, the passage is often read along these lines and considered, especially by scholars of Etruscan civilization, as a sort of groundwork for all the major stereotypes later developed by both Greek and Latin authors, which portray the Etruscans as a barbaric and cruel people, also because devoted to human sacrifices. Another consequence of this Hellenocentric reading is even more noteworthy, and it is relative to the explanation offered by for Herodotus' silence about an historical episode that he could or should have known and mentioned. I mean, the immolation to Dionysus of Mestes of 3 young noble persons by Themistocles before the Battle of Salamis, known instead to Plutarch in the life of Themistocles, who indulges in details and quotes as his source Phanias of Eresus. According to some scholars, for example, Michelson, Herodotus would have intentionally omitted the affair in order not to stain the great and deserved victory with an act so unacceptable to the Greek mentality. In the same vein, but with a reversal of perspective, already Plutarch himself in his polemical treatise on the malice of Herodotus, defined the historian with the term Philobarbaros, which had a long-standing fortune, but is an apax and is pejorative, exactly because he denied that the Egyptian made human sacrifices and dared to impute the slaying of 2 children in Egypt to the Greek hero Menelaus. The same Plutarch, however, did not shy away from crediting the Greeks on more than one occasion with having resorted to human sacrifice, as in the already mentioned episode about Themistocles, though there he cast the responsibility on the mob, as he does often, but also in the life of Pelopidas and of Philopaemen. At the root of this clashing interpretation of Herodotus' attitude, spokesman for Hellenocentrism on the one hand, pro-barbarian on the other, lies the main difficulty, that is the question of the Herodotus' reliability. Here, especially with regard to the ethnographic section, book 1.4, which contain most of the supposed human sacrifice, 9 out of 14. Of course, this is such a complex issue that it cannot even be summarized, and I am happy it is not necessary here. At any rate, I believe that it's not possible to evaluate all the passages about human sacrifice according to a single preconceived criterion. It should be necessary to analyze them on a case-by-case basis. As the instances I said are numerous, I have no intention to do so now. I just collected on the handout all the passages to which scholars have variously attributed the meaning of human sacrifices, and I tried to observe them in a much less technological way than Aaron or Cassandra did, grouping them under different headings. In fact, not all the cases mentioned by Herodotus can be assimilated to the same category. We may apply the distinction between human sacrifices, where a divinity appears to be implied, ritual killings, and following into death. But even if we consider them as a whole, apart from this distinction, they can be divided in several ways: between Greeks and barbarians, between mythical ages and historical times, between repeated rituals and single episodes that seem occasional. They can also be considered according to the age or sex of the victims: men, women, children, elderly, or according to their status, between free individuals and foreigners, for prisoners, slaves, servants. What information is possible to extract from these orderings, I am not sure, beyond the distinction between Greeks and barbarians, which is undoubtedly self-evident. I have not attempted instead to classify the episode according to the vocabulary of sacrifice employed in each case, because this venue has been already explored by Dennis Hughes, but also because no firm conclusion can be reached from terminology in cases of this kind, at least in my opinion. Herodotus' lexicon is in many ways elastic, adjustable, and hardly allows assumption based solely on the use of a particular verb or noun. Other perspectives of investigation could perhaps be more fruitful. And I think the most promising could be precisely that of contextualizing each single episode, an exercise which, as I said, I will not attempt here, except for some general remarks about the ethnic subdivision. More exactly, I will limit myself to mentioning the cases in which scholars of individual civilization have judged Herodotus' account plausible or even accurate. In the first place, we can confidently rule out, exclude from the analysis the Egyptians, whose use of human sacrifice is not at all demonstrated by text number 3. I don't know if, okay. On which I read the very good analysis of Andreas Schwab in his book of 2020 book. and is denied by Herodotus himself, as his comments, so irritating to Plutarch, show in text number 2. I exclude also text number 1. And there it, oh no, I didn't put it. Also the text number 1 about Massageti, because the rite is profoundly different from what we may understand as human sacrifice in general. The Scythians, whose rituals of this kind are the most accurately described, are instead noteworthy. Because archaeological investigation has shown that at least the lengthy and gloomy account of the following into death ceremonies for the dead kings are not an invention, not a deliberate revision in an Hellenocentric key. Askod Ivanchik, an expert on the Scythian world, in a recent study, of which here is a summary table, has compared the archaeological findings with Herodotus data on the king's funerals, which are all confirmed at the fundamental points. The reliability of the historian could be extended to his description of the sanctuary of Ares, where he says the Scythians perform human sacrifice. Their possible correspondence with structural and functional elements of kurgan-like complexes of the Scythian period without human burials has been recently established by Gershovik and Romashko. I would also underline the strong power of suggestion of these chapters, as I discovered that Herodotus' Scythian rituals inspired the contest sculpture Memento Marengo, a life-size 3D printed copy of the skeleton of Marengo, Napoleon's favorite horse, which the French artist Pascal Convert has placed under the dome of Les Invalides in Paris, above the tomb of the emperor, as part of the commemoration for the bicentenary of his death. Also, for the sacrifice practiced by the Getae, Herodotus offers quite circumstantial information, which now some scholars, especially Dobriela Kotova, tend to recognize as an interpretatio Greca of the following into death rituals. In this sense, should be understood the strange ritual of the messenger to Salmoxis. As Herodotus states, Salmoxis is not properly a god, but a former king who had pretended to die and then raised from the dead. The ritual killings would be periodic ceremonies accompanying a kind of king of kings who continued to live in the afterlife. Another Totenfolge ritual, number 10, is certainly the voluntary immolation of the most beloved concubine among those Thracians living beyond the Crestonei, which has been related to the ritual of Sati or Suti, practiced in many societies. The only instance of a real Thracian human sacrifice that is dedicated to a deity is the one mentioned in 9-119, that is the last one, number 14, in which the Thracians sacrifice the Persian Eubazus to the local god Pleistoros, according to their custom, while kill in another way the men who were with him. Unfortunately, both the local god and the sacrifice are known only from this passage. As it has been remarked by Rosaria Munson, for example, the episode of Eubazus is immediately followed by that of Xantippus and the Athenian punishment of Artaeutes, who, for a religious crime, was crucified and forced to witness the stoning of his son. The parallel between the two passages is, I think, striking, because the Athenian one is not a sacrifice, a human sacrifice. For reason of time and the extremely complex nature of the tradition, I will not touch upon the human sacrifice of the Taurians to a deity called the Maiden, and associated to some extent with the Iphigenia. I just remarked that here Herodotus report contradictory versions. Says some say other instead, and those versions different from the that of Euripides' Iphigenia among the Taurians. To sum up, at least some of the ritual practices that Herodotus attributes to barbarians, and especially the totem folge rites, are considered plausible by scholars of this civilization. Where, on the other hand, actual human sacrifices are involved, the assessment becomes problematic, also due to the absence of other reliable data. To return finally to my starting point, I have tried to place the passages relating to the Persian human sacrifice against this framework. I gathered the impression that, especially in their regard, an intentional reworking of information may be detected. There is indeed reason to believe that the attestations are biased, or at least more ideological represented. Yet sometimes Herodotus seems to share his responsibility with modern interpreters. For example, the first episode, generally labeled as Persian, is number 12, should be excluded, since the killing is performed by barbarians, says Herodotus, whose ship was part of the great skiing fleet. They were actually Phoenicians, and it has been argued that the ritual killing of the Greek prisoner on the prow of the ship is comparable with the sacrificial customs. Also, the episode of Cambyses is number 5, who convicted of some minor offense 12 noble Persians and had them buried alive, appears unconvincing, despite Asheri opinions, as a human sacrifice, or at least this cannot be inferred from Herodotus' text. Rather, it appears more like a proof of Cambyses' insanity or a legal, though excessive, condemnation, without any reference to religious motives. Yet, the manner of execution, burying alive, probably drew it into the category of a human sacrifice. Precisely this treatment occurs in the two other cases already mentioned, attributed to the Persian, the episode of the 9 roads and Amestri and the Disepta Persian children. In this last circumstance, as in 186, the killing is an offer to a god. This raises doubts, as human sacrifice is not otherwise attested, as far as I know, among the Persian, nor it is a practice compatible with Zoroastrian religion. Moreover, Amestrid is mentioned elsewhere in the histories, in famous passages at the end of the ninth book, 108, 113, and also by Ctesias as the author of uncommon cruelties, impaling, beheading, and so on. And our passage reveals lexical anomalies. For example, the ambiguous meaning of antikarizestai, which is not clear what does it mean, and objective difficulty. It is not at all clear to which Persian god the historian is referring with the expression, the god said to be beneath the earth. Ahriman, the evil principal, antagonist of Ahura Mazda, is not worshipped in any way. If the facts had any basis, one should think, like boys, of tradition related to pre-Zoroastrian deities. That burying people alive was burying people alive was a Persian custom is explicitly stated, but as Robert Parker has observed, with reason, it's difficult to suppose that a people should have practiced burial alive both as a form of punishment or outrage against enemy, and also as a ritual, a way to communicate with gods. At this level of my survey, still a work in progress, I am well aware to be far from any conclusion. But there is one aspect that strikes me and perhaps could be of some help in assessing Herodotus' position on human sacrifice without falling into the trap of his ethnocentrism, which is certainly undisputable, but which sometimes seems to me to be applied too automatically to his narrative. In the histories, the victims of human sacrifice are, for the most part, men, rather than women or children. In contrast to what I have learned so far about other civilizations, where the victims are more often defenseless and weak. Also, many of the individuals sacrificed are war prisoners, or slave, or foreigners, as well as the children are not simply children, but the sons of the enemy, like the Lydian, the local Thracian, or personal enemies, probably in the case of Amestris. Eventually, the totem-folk rituals are reserved to kings or powerful men. This, as proposed by anthropologists in other contexts, could point to a strong link between ritual execution and highly hierarchical, if not properly state political power. Given that the affirmation of a power over the lives of other men is never so clear as in their killing. This is especially true for autocratic rulership, with its close connection with war and the exercise of judicial power, a connection which blurred the boundaries between the use of sacrifice and other types of control over human death. In this perspective, I wonder whether Herodotus might have chosen to charge the exercise of violence by autocratic powers also through their use or abuse of the religious dimensions. This would explain the attribution of human sacrifices to the Persian kings and queens, and not to the Persian as a people, hinting to the fundamental political facies of religious violence. But at this stage, this is just speculation. So I thank you in advance for your very welcome thoughts and suggestions, and of course for your attention. Thank you.